Join us on the Poetic Odyssey, a celebration of voices, cultures, and the power of words. I'm Amanda Eke. Welcome to The Poet Speaks, where every syllable ignites inspiration.
Year in Zimbabwe.
What stories are on these tracks?
This idea of the Bronx, now, boogie down Bronx, that's what people say, right?
Don't become someone's subway story.
Medicate me with a lick and a like. I am not afraid to love you.
All of us have a story.
Magnifying glass because you can't see otherwise.
No one wanted to listen.
Yeah.
So I think that's what made me a writer.
In writing, the writing just comes.
You ready? Amazing poetry awaits.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Poet Speaks podcast. Now, our next guest is a first-generation Armenian-American poet. He's the current poet in residence for Washington Park Association in Hudson County and the founder of a weekly open mic and safe space open forum, The Poetry Unfold in Union City, where he facilitates poetry sessions designed to empower fellow local poets. His writing and poetry have appeared in Soup Can Magazine, Persian Cat Poetry, The Jersey Journal, The Carol's Peace Journal, and Way Small Press. He's completed 2 collections of poetry, Survival Witness, and dedicated that to the Armenians of Artsakh and Palestinians of Gaza. Everyone, welcome to the Poet Speaks podcast, Yetvart Majian. Yetvart, how are you?
I'm very well. Happy to be here with you. How are you?
I'm doing good, doing pretty good, doing as good as we can in times like this, but poetry is always here to lift us up. So that's always a good thing to talk it and talk that cash money poetry. All right. So tell us, where are you at in the world right now? Tell us a little bit, where's your location? Where are we talking to you from tonight?
I am in Union City, New Jersey. For those who don't know, it's across the river from Manhattan, across the Hudson River, about 15-20 minutes from Manhattan on a good trip.
Okay, nice. So is it like so New Jersey prices with the New York City experience?
Sort of, although that's starting to change. Gentrification is a thing. And so New Jersey prices are changing quickly and rapidly.
Wow. Tell us.
In my childhood, that was the case in my childhood for sure. Like New York was always the place you went to and then came back.
Oh my goodness. Wow. Tell us a bit. Were you born and bred Jersey boy, or did you grow up elsewhere? Tell us a little bit.
Yeah, the former. I was born in Secaucus, New Jersey. I still have no idea why. I've never lived a day of my life in Secaucus. I guess my mom was just there when it was time. And then grew up in Weehawken. That's where I went to high school, and Union City. But for anybody who knows this area, these cities are all very close to each other. And so, yeah, this Hudson County basically is where I grew up. That's home for me. And I've traveled a fair bit, but I always come back because I was raised by grandparents who've needed my attention as I get older.
Wow. That's amazing. Tell us about the poetry community there. I think, of course, like you said, you're so close to New York City. Many people know about its sordid but amazing history of poetry, jazz. I mean, all the arts. What is Jersey? Does Jersey have that same type of history and footprint?
Yeah, Jersey has some pretty renowned poets that come from Jersey. I think I'll just sort of take that in the direction of saying that in the last few years, there's been a very, very happening, burgeoning art scene on this side of the river. There always has been. Like, there have been certain luminaries who have been fostering community and poetry on this side of the river for as long as I've known. So for the last 2 decades, I've been aware of people who've been doing that work. But particularly since COVID, our Jersey side has been flourishing a lot. And there have been organizers, I'm lucky to be one of the organizers on this side of the river who have been sort of organizing and bringing people together. But there's a lot of movement back and forth into the city. There's a lot of movement like with Philly, with Staten Island. I mean, there are a lot of different poetry communities that are so close to us that are finally sort of interacting more and more. So I do know the New York City poetry scene. I'm a part of it. And on this side of the river, we definitely have hubs. Like when you were reading my bio, for example, you said and published in Way Small Press. I just want to give a quick shout out to Way, because By the Way magazine drops tomorrow, actually, and they published 2 of my pieces. So John, Marinel, Way, thank you. So there are a lot of communities like Way, like the Poetry Unfold on our side of the river, that are consistent and have their own hub. And we interact regularly with New York City and the surrounding communities as well.
Wow, no, that's amazing. That's amazing. I think a lot of people, as I said, it's the idea of the city, New York City. It's such a big character. So it's kind of its tentacles just flow within the state of New York, but also the surrounding areas. So great to see those kind of indie roots that you mentioned, like the Way Out magazine. Now tell us, let's kind of get into it. Your work, like I had read in your bio, your work focuses on the subtleties of human intersubjectivity, is what you say, and drawing from your Armenian legacy of genocide and diaspora. Tell us a bit about growing up in Jersey. Tell us a bit about how that has led you to now. What is that life's path with your poetry and your writing?
Intersubjectivity is just like a fancy philosophy way of saying interbeing, being together, and how we interact and how we become together and how we unfold into being together. So I'm really fascinated by those kinds of things. A lot of poems of mine that are not necessarily resistance or political pieces, they're a little bit more subtle. They tend to be about very subtle, overlooked interactions, like a person saying or doing something on a bus and that having a seeming impact on someone else. And it would have all been invisible if there weren't a poet there to record it or to think about it or to take a literary photograph of it. So that's kind of what I'm talking about there. As far as the Armenian, there's a lot more to the Armenian legacy than genocide. Diaspora is a huge, huge part of it. Armenians were subject to genocide in the 20th century. It was the first modern genocide. Modernity being in terms of the tools that were used, because the first genocide of the 20th century was a Herero genocide in 1905, modern day Namibia. And so since that period of time, the Armenians have been dispersed throughout the globe, all over the world. We've had communities in every country that you can name. And that's a very, very important part of what has become Armenian identity today. And we're seeing now the diasporification of Palestinians, for example, and people from other parts of the world as well. It's not just genocide, but so that's something that has been really prominent because I was raised by grandparents that rooted me and steeped me in community and in cultural heritage. But Armenians also have a very long tradition of writing and poetry that goes to like the 5th century AD. So all those things figure prominently in my life, those elements, but I also grew up in a Latino neighborhood. So that also figures very prominently for me. I grew up as an inner city kid in a Latino neighborhood. So that really is also just as important a part of it, my identity, as everything else we've mentioned.
That's a very interesting kind of polarities that you had. So growing up in Jersey, but also in the same breath, growing up in a Latino neighborhood. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, you are an Armenian-American, like I said before, you're first generation. Kind of having that whole impact of immigration, as someone that's also first generation with immigrant parents, how did that kind of, what viewpoint do you have as a first generation Armenian boy growing up in Jersey, Latino neighborhood in the United States? What impact did that have, having your parents with this type of legacy now impacting you as a young boy living in a place where, like you said, many people aren't even aware of it?
I think it just makes me inherently intersectional. I think that comes really easily and naturally to me. If I'm in a very insular Armenian community, I tend to have viewpoints that are shaped by growing up in an inner city Latino community and going to a public school. So I went to Armenian school until 2nd grade, or something like that. And then I went to public school. So I tend to have a very different worldview. My grandparents lived in Brazil for 5 years and then South Africa and Pretoria for 5 years while Mandela was in jail. And so as I got older and heard stories of their time there, And just some of the stories, like for example, my grandparents would tell me stories of life in South Africa that they didn't recognize necessarily as tied to apartheid. But in telling me the stories, because I studied social justice and politics and philosophy, and I'm really interested in these human rights issues, in hearing their stories, it became evident to me that the reason why they saw what they saw and the way that they saw, and that they were exposed to certain people in certain contexts, was tied very much to apartheid South Africa. And in talking to them about that, there have been a lot of realizations intergenerationally between us. Like I watched a movie about Mandela with them, and it was very moving to see them react to that, because they saw South Africa in a different way than what they had lived. And things started to become clearer to them. And my grandfather's told me some incredible stories about actual everyday acts of resistance to apartheid. He was a pretty incredible person. He passed away. But I was raised by them. So that also is a really big part of my poetry. It's a really big part of my consciousness, consciousness, but also conscience. I was thinking of both of those words, and they're both, my conscience is very much tied to this kind of worldly intersectional approach. In my family, there are multiple languages. My grandmother's very good with language and absorbed the languages of all the countries that she traveled to. And I got a little bit of that gift too. I speak 4 languages. So all of that makes me inherently to people and to stories and to identities and intrinsic humanness.
That multi-dimension of self is very, very fascinating, and I'm sure has now kind of established you as a writer and what you write about. Tell us about your journey to become a writer. When did that find you? Was it in childhood? Was it in later adult years? Tell us a bit about your journey to becoming this poet that you are today.
Yeah, I've answered, it's interesting. I answered that question once, I remember, by talking about my earliest experiences of writing, which weren't super pleasant, because I had studied Armenian language as a child. And so in my single digit years, I was very proficient in Armenian, and I would write in Armenian. And I remember I had a very turbulent childhood. I was subject to child abuse. And I remember using Armenian to write little notes to my grandmother. So that's like my first actual experience or memory of writing. It was me writing to create a sort of space for myself to tell what I thought was important to somebody that I knew cared about me and loved me, and it made me feel safer. And then the second thing, I was thinking about this, for 1 year of my life, I lived in Houston, Texas. It's a long story and it's not really an important one, but I lived in Houston, Texas for a year. And I also was diagnosed with dyslexia at a young age. So I remember vividly an assignment that I was to write 1 or 2 pages about some imaginary story. And so I wrote about 3 or 4 pages front and back. And as far as I can remember, it was some adaptation of Peter Pan. It was like my own spin on that kind of a story. And I wrote this thing and I was so proud of it. And I handed it in. And then the teacher called my mom to the school, because that was the 1 year of my life that I lived with my mom. So she was the parent and guardian who came. And I thought, like, this is dope. Like, I wrote this cool thing. And all the teacher really had to say is, this kid can't write. This kid, he can't spell. He's got issues, And then I remember I was punished for that. And it was Mrs. Pickup is her name, because I still have the report card from her. And that was a kind of like, as an adult, when I look back and I think about, how teachers can impact us at a very, very early age. I think if a child gave me 3 or 4 pages front and back of writing, I would say that child's a writer. How do I help this child grow into themselves?
Yeah.
But unfortunately, that's just not what happened then. But when I look back, I think, like, that's the kid. Like that kid always was going to be a writer at some point, somehow. That kid wanted to communicate with the world. Unfortunately, it took a little longer to figure out how letters fit together to make words for me in English.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those things. I feel like childhood is just so full of feelings that are very inarticulate that you just don't have the articulation for. Tell us then, how did that transgress for you professionally to where you are now? Obviously, so you kind of discovered this as a, like you said, single digits. How did that progress as you grew up into, teenage years to young adult into writing as
Yeah,
a career?
always wrote. I think for me, it was always early. It was just like reflection. It was me thinking through things, thinking about, I remember thinking a lot about God in my early teen years. There were a lot of poems of
Wow.
me sort of questioning, like, what is this thing? And trying to make sense of it, probably just philosophizing. I think every human being is a natural philosopher. And when they start
Yeah.
thinking about why they're here, they start doing philosophy. And if you start writing about it in little fragments, you sort of become a poet, I think. And that was the early stuff was about just inquiry and thought. And again, because I had experienced abuse, I think a lot of my thinking was about why things are the way they are, why people, I remember always wondering why people behave the way, and then coming to conclusions about why people behave the way that they behave. As I got older and went to university, my writing became more academic. I studied more intellectual, academic disciplines. So
Mm-hmm.
I wrote poetry on my own, but it wasn't part of, like, most of my writing was academic writing. I studied, political theory, genocide, nonviolence, social movements. So that's the sort of thing that I was writing. Identity, I started writing about toward the end of my years in undergrad. I was writing more poetry again, and I think I had come to the conclusion that artistic expression was really, really important. Like, having gone through the intellectual academic expression, I came to the conclusion that communicating with one another in society artistically is a super, super important way of imparting ideas. That, I think that's it. I read a lot of poetry, and I continue to read a lot of poetry. I think that poets pry open spaces and carve out spaces, and I think that's why it's always attracted me.
Absolutely. Tell me a bit about kind of going off of what you said there. What do you think is the role of a poet then in our world today? We're in a very ever-changing landscape every day, every moment, right? We're in a different time, right? Almost, it feels like. How important do you think the role of the poet is in the year 2025 in our society?
Unbelievably important. There's a reason why poets are often the first ones to be arrested, killed, shut down if they become prominent. Poets speak, they try their best, I think, to speak truth. But I think that there are as many roles and reasons for poetry as there are poets. And I think there are different kinds of poets for different reasons. But if you ask me what I think the role of a poet is, I think the poet, Nina Simone said the poet's job is to speak to the times. Noel Figueroa, who interviewed me once for Poets with Purpose, reminded me of that while we were talking in an interview. And I thought that was a really wonderful thing to point out. And what an incredible figure to point out. But to speak to the times, that's always been true for Armenians. As far back as you go in poetry for Armenians, they have been documenting things about what's happened to them. Like, if you look at the Armenian poet Siamanto, he wrote a poem called The Dancers. And it was it's a very difficult poem to read. It's about genocide. But he was documenting it. And so the poets document things that oftentimes other people don't. They're the first to document, or the first ones to stand up and address something. So I think that poets are vital. I don't think there's ever been a resistance movement without poetry as a really big part of it. During the Soviet years, there was Baruch Sevak in Armenia, Soviet Armenia. My grandmother's brother, Harutun Zakarian, in Romania, was a poet, an anti-communist poet. So even in my own family, there is this, like, when I think about what's the role of the poet, and I think at Armenian, the trajectory of Armenian poets from like the 5th century to present, the way they've used language to communicate and document. And then I look at my own family and I look at poets that I'm inspired by, like, Nina Simone and so many others. I think that's the role of the poet. And we see now in Gaza how important poetry has been. Poets were literally being assassinated by occupying forces. So that, I think, tells us how important poets are, because they speak the truth, and to oppressors and to perpetrators, all of truth is the enemy.
Yeah. Tell me a bit about then, how do you find yourself balancing between the two, as someone as yourself that is so based not only just with writing, but also it seems spiritually you're and emotionally grounded in, the culture of your people, and that's where your art really it has the fertile ground to grow from. How do you then balance that with the occupation of capitalism? To keep something running, to keep our poetry collection surviving, you have to sign deals to get yourself published. How do you balance the two?
That's such an important question. That I was thinking about just ahead of our interview, I was thinking, like, are there people who have really touched me in a way that I really want to mention in this interview? And there are a few, and one in particular, I want to say, we have kind of an Instagram friendship. Emily Stoddard started something called the Poetry Bulletin. And I'm saying this because every person who listens to this interview should get a hold of Emily Stoddard's Poetry Bulletin, should say thank you to Emily, because Emily started this labor of love some years ago. It's a bulletin, and she basically documents all of the different submission periods and magazines and journals and deadlines and contests. Not only does she make it all accessible for poets to facilitate poets, she also helps poets understand exactly, she speaks exactly to what you're saying, Amanda. She does basically analyses of how much submission fees go up a year. What's the average submission fee right now? What is it costing for poets to try to get their work out there? Are these publishers offering any kind of waivers or help to people who are in need? Or is everything gatekept financially? So she'll break down the list and show you which publishers are actually offering waivers, which publishers are reasonable in their pricing, how much. She even recently, I read a piece that she wrote about how she tracked what one publisher was getting in terms of grants and how little they were giving out. And so then did analysis and realized that actually this particular publisher was making more money with submission fees than they were in book sales.
Wow.
And so I think these things speak to what you're saying, Amanda, and also the awareness of which publishers are censoring poetry and which publishers are safe. For example, for Armenians to talk about atrocities being committed against them, for Palestinians to talk about atrocities being committed against them, which publishers are uplifting voices and giving space. So as a poet now, I'm actively trying to navigate this, and I find Emily's work really helpful and really inspiring, and it feels so good to know that there are people who are thinking about their fellow poets in this way and wanting to do things that uplift poetry. So I'm trying to figure that out. I'm trying to figure out what the best home would be for my collection. And also, I think you bring up the point of how much time do we spend serving late stage capitalism, and how much time do we spend serving our vision of what this life should be? We have one precious life, as Mary Oliver points out. What do we do with this? What do we do with it? Is it all in service of capitalism, or are we trying to do other things?
Yeah, absolutely. You make such great points. It is this idea of, what is it I like to say about as an artist that's a professional artist, I would say 15% of what we do is the creativity side. The other 85%, unfortunately, is the business, dotting I's, crossing T's, keeping up with those small tasks to be able to just produce creatively without those limits and barriers being put on you. So it does always become a question of the mind of, well, where's the boundary? Where do you draw the line? Where do we get the break? Is there a break? Because eventually you'll come to the point where you realize, these things, they don't make themselves out of thin blue air, or maybe they can. Maybe there's just a space we haven't created yet, and we're still finding the words to finding the ways to put that into words. So, tell us a bit about your work professionally, the Poetry Unfold. Tell us a little bit about how that began. Like you said, I said in your bio, safe space, weekly open mic forum that's in Union City. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so I think most of your viewers will be aware of the genocide taking place in Gaza and what Palestinians are facing. That began in October of 2023. Armenians have faced a very similar horrific kind of encounter with contemporary times. There was an ethnic cleansing between 2020 to 2023 in which thousands of Armenians were murdered by Azerbaijan and Turkey. 70% of the weapons were Israeli, actually. And so you can see some deep connections, but I don't want to get hung up in that. I just want to point out that this was a very difficult time for me as an Armenian in the world, somebody who had studied genocide academically, not just the Armenian genocide, but all genocide. I hadn't seen anything like this carnage in my time. I'd been advocating for Sudan in like the early 2000s in Darfur. I'd been witness to that. But to see Armenians being, I'm sorry, trigger warning, folks, decapitated, raped, skewered alive. There are videos of this that were surfaced on Telegram that I was literally documenting and trying to get to media to get coverage for it. This all took place within a blind spot of contemporary consciousness. And again, the ethnic cleansing culminated in 2023. Azerbaijan and Turkey ethnically cleansed 120,000 ethnic Armenians off of their ethnic sort of sovereign indigenous land, Nagorno-Karabakh, what we call Artsakh. Actually, you said it earlier, so thank you for naming it Artsakh. And during this period of time, there's a psychotherapist named Armand Volkas, who created Healing Wounds of History, which is a modality that's a drama therapy modality. And it works specifically with intergenerational trauma and what people carry, the stories that we carry in our bodies. Armand has worked with identities all around the world. During this time for Armenians, Armand started to offer workshops for Armenians, to offer like healing groups. And I, through a mutual friend, joined Armand, and we became close friends in that way. And he became a mentor to me, and I continued to study with him. This was at this point years ago. That was all very fresh in what was becoming of me as a person, like exploring healing spaces and the importance of drama therapy and just healing work in general. How do you support community? So at around the same time, it was also post-COVID, and people were not super social anymore. There weren't too many places where people could meet and discourse. So I thought, start an open mic, but also, having been so influenced profoundly by Healing Wounds of History, could I add a component to it that I call the open forum component? And that's how this model came about. And it's a very unique sort of signature model. And we've been kind of growing it for three years now and developing it into its own thing. It's called the Poetry Unfold. And basically every poet would come, like Amanda, you would come, you would do your piece. And then afterwards, the open forum would be open for you, and the audience would talk back to you about your piece. And they're very gently coached, like, please make I statements. This brings this up for me. It reminds me of this, but don't speak on behalf of other people. Don't generalize. Say anything you need to say, but do it mindfully. And this allows the poet to be in conversation with the audience. And it's a really, really wonderful experience. So rather than getting up, doing your poem and sitting down, there's a period where the poem breathes in the room. And that's the model for the Poetry Unfold. And that's also a kind of abridged version, or maybe not so abridged version, of how it came to be.
No, that's beautiful and amazing. That's I'm sure that type of forum, I'm sure this has so many possibilities to what could unfold in that. What's been one of the best moments that you've seen unfold between the poet and the audience?
There are a few different kinds of best moments. One that comes to mind is when, I'll just say, also when I was going through the most difficult times with what Azerbaijan and Turkey were doing to Armenians and doing advocacy work, the Unfold community and the poets that I was in community with were the first people who started to hear my early writing at that point. So that was so when the siege on Gaza started, I remember being very aware that the Poetry Unfold was going to be, at least in short term, one of the very few places where Palestinian voices would be allowed to speak without being suppressed and shut down.
Wow.
Because I had experienced censorship through academia for 2 decades. And I knew how hard it was to talk about Palestine, Israel, never mind the fact that when there's an active bombing campaign in 2000, gosh, was it 2008 when Israel bombed Gaza last time? I remember being on a project called the Journey for Humanity and being in a congressional meeting lobbying for attention on Darfur and mentioning the bombing of Gaza and being told I couldn't talk about that in the context of genocide, and just not being able to talk about. So anyway, I remember all of this from my own development academically. And so when this began, I was very deliberate about making sure Palestinian voices would be heard, and that space would be pried open. So we had a Palestinian poet come in. I remember this very vividly. He came in, and I immediately recognized how he must have felt because of how I had felt for the last 4 years trying to talk about Armenians. And he said, look, I don't really usually do poetry, but I just wanted to be able to do a poem. And he did Rafat Al-Arir's poem, If I Must Die, Then You Must Be a Tale. Let Me Be a Tale. And that meant a lot to the entire room. But for that poet, for that person, I realized that's what the importance of this is. There needs to be spaces where that can be spoken out loud. So that stands out. Another thing that stands out for me is times when poems touch on something like maybe domestic violence or growing up in the inner city. And then all of a sudden, you can see that the group sort of blossoms its little affinity group. And there are multiple people in that audience who are really feeling that poem and they can speak about it now. And now sometimes we'll do exercises that come from Healing Wounds of History where they're designed to basically, so if this is something I didn't say that I should, sometimes these topics can be really charged and hot. And if something comes up and you can feel the energy of the room really become tense, there are certain exercises that come from Healing Wounds of History that I would use to bring the conversation back safely to shore so that no one is isolated in their trauma. In one particular instance, there was a conversation about domestic violence, and you could see the connections and the empowerment of people discussing this openly. And for men in the room who have never heard this discourse to be exposed to it and to play a listening role, a support role, that's what I think is the most powerful part of this, is that it really creates a space for perspectives that are often not heard and metabolized to be heard, and you build relationships and people start to, basically it fosters empathy. That's what I'm trying to say, is we get to a place where empathy is fostered. And I think it's also very magical when poets hear responses back that they didn't realize. You know, like a poet hears an audience member say, this is what I heard. And that poet suddenly realizes, there's one instance, I don't want to name it right now, but one poet was super touched by the fact that their poem communicated the messages that it did. And if they hadn't had that kind of an unfold experience with these exercises, they may have never heard the audience tell them that these particular things came out for me.
Yes.
And that's powerful too.
No, it seems like you've really fostered a space of a lot of people harnessing their power, but also people not even realizing the power that they actually had, the resilience, resistance, and like you said, empathy, being able to create that in a space. So tell us, moving on a bit, tell us about your poetry collection, Survival Witness.
Yeah, before I do that, I just want to say it's a work in progress. I don't want to make it sound like it's this beautiful. It's we're working it, we're figuring it out, we're fostering it, and it takes an entire community to hold those kinds of containers. Over time, the regulars become such beautiful models for empathetic listening and models for how to discourse. So it's very much a very beautiful work in progress. So, sorry, you're asking about my current collection? Is that what you said?
Tell us about your poetry collection, Survival Witness.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for asking about that. Survival Witness is my latest collection. This is my copy for performances. And it is basically a collection of poetry that documents my witness to what began in 2020 when Armenians were being subject to genocidal attacks and ethnic cleansing, and then how in 2023 that led to another case of genocidal ethnic cleansing against Palestinians. And so the book is kind of it's a collection of witness poetry and solidarity poetry. The subtitle is Poems of Forced Displacement, Memory, and Solidarity. And so I think what the collection struggles with is, what do we do with these inherited legacies of genocide and displacement and trauma? And how do we, what does it lead to? And in this collection, for me, it leads to positionality and it leads to solidarity. I think anyone who's been subject to fascist rhetoric or fascist ideology or genocide inherently in their bodies understands what that kind of injustice is. And so it leads to a sense of solidarity with people. So specifically, I'm talking to the Palestinian struggle and the Armenian struggle in this volume. But within it, there's allusions and references to Black America and to migration and immigration, and sort of drawing from how I grew up. So that's the way that I would describe this collection. It's been evolving for about a year. It's in its final iteration, and I'm really happy with where it is. I've been performing this collection for about 2 or 3 years, and it's been my way of doing advocacy work. I've performed at sort of political spaces. I've performed it in just poetry and art spaces. So for me, it's really a work that has been very much alive. It's been evolving, it's been changing, and putting it together with, what I found is that creating a collection and even deciding which poems go in which order, the composition aspect of it is a whole different example of brushstrokes for a poet, right? I never realized just how much we are like painters until I started to put together a collection, because I realized that every choice is a brushstroke. This highlights this lightens this darkens that. My friend John Chagona says you need a respite poem sometimes. And so this respite poem then gives you the space. And so that in that way, it's a different layer of composition work. So I don't know. These are the things that I feel called to say about Survival Witness. It's a poetry collection I care very much about. And I really hope to see it find a home. Individual poems have been finding homes over the last year, and it's out now with publishers. And I've just gotten my own copy this year to start performing it.
Absolutely. Congratulations on that. Tell us a bit, just kind of briefly, that title is very, very powerful, Survival Witness. Kind of went into it, but tell us, what was the kind of finality moment of this should be what my poetry collection is called, that Survival Witness, those 2 words.
Wow. Thanks, Amanda. I had it, not a lot of people know what the title is because it's only recently, this is the last iteration, and now it's become Survival Witness. And actually, I was thinking this week that I feel really, really super comfortable with that title. There have been number of titles that I was working with, and this became the one. So to hear you say that, just that's really sweet. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'd like to know what it communicates to you. Should you want to talk to it first, or should I?
Oh, sure. I mean, when I hear the word survival witness, I mean, it's almost like survival's guilt in some ways. That's what triggers my mind a little bit. It's, you're a witness to maybe things that you didn't want to see, but you're the only one left standing. So you've been left to survive, but witness so much horror, so much pain, so much joy, but you're the last one standing and you've had to survive, but you've had to see a lot.
Yeah, I really appreciate. I'm so glad that you thanks for your generosity and taking a risk and offering that. That meant a lot to me. You're right. That's very much a part of it. But also, survival witness is being witness to the acts of survival. Recognizing that there are resistors, for example. The collection highlights that there have been resistors throughout all these horrible things, that there are these pathways back to humanity. So survival witness, witnessing what is the stuff of survival. How do we survive? And it's also declarative, like we are survivors. We're not just victims of these crimes. We're survivors of these crimes. And survival witness, again, is my way of trying to offer up an image, an idea, a concept for what we do with intergenerational trauma, decontextualized trauma. So, trauma is so hot and open now, like people talk about it, but what are we doing with it? And I think that more than ever, we need to be showing up for our trans friends, for our Black friends, for our Palestinian friends, for our Armenian friends, for Sudan, for Congo, as many people, and we can't do it on our own. Like, this is something that I find myself saying often. It's overwhelming. We can't all name everything, but together we can name a whole lot. And so survival witness is about being somebody who identifies with a legacy of trauma and who allows that legacy of trauma to inform their positionality in the world today. And that's for me a really big part of it. So it's both saying we will survive. It's also saying we have survived. There are poems in there about being an Armenian a century after the genocide took place, and finding yourself in an inner city Latino neighborhood being like, yo, the only reason I'm here right now is because there was a genocide. Like, that's messed up and that's weird, but that informs what I'm looking at right now. And there are poems about saying to Palestinian siblings, we see you as Armenians. I see the writing on the wall. Armenians have been subject to genocide denial for a century. So now, as an Armenian, when I hear Netanyahu say that he's earmarked $1.8 million to discussing the war in Gaza, what that sounds like to me is he's just allocated that much money to the deliberate revision of history and denial that Palestinians are going to have to now endure after the genocide, the cultural genocide that comes after the physical genocide, the renaming of things, the renaming. Turks have renamed plants from their Latin roots. They've taken the pronoun, so the prefix Armen out of plants and animals. They've tried to change and erase Armenians out of scientific journals. So this is the extent, the madness to which perpetrators of genocide will go. And as an Armenian, we see that. So there's a line in one of my poems called Mud More Merciful, just got published, and by the way. And the line is, I think it's for the children who will one day be told Zahtar is Israeli, the way that we've been told Lavash is Turkish. And so in that way, survival witness is saying, like, look, this is what's in my bones and in my genetics and my epigenetics. And this allows me to speak very clearly to denial and revisionism when I see it today. And it tells me where I need to stand and who I need to stand with. So I hope that answers to some degree.
Absolutely. Gorgeous, gorgeous. Tell me because I think it's such a pertinent point in a person's life when, like you said, you, because of your experience, you now can you're so firm. You're so confident in what you have to say. Your words, your prepositions, your verbs, your vowels, everything is aligned because everything almost has led up to this moment for you to stand tall in what you believe in. What is it like? I mean, do you feel like you're at that point in your life, not only as a poet, but just as a person, to where you're very rooted in your beliefs to just, hey, this is now my life's path. This is where I stand and I'm not falling. Do you feel like you're at that point in your life?
I think I'm getting there. That observation touches me deeply, Amanda. I like your questions. That's something that I think about a lot. I think every poet probably thinks about, right? Like, do you remember when a switch went off and you were like, I deserve to have a voice. I deserve to be here. Like, my voice belongs. That's such an important thing. I think there's so much childhood trauma that we've all experienced that tells us to, hey, know your place. And, and sometimes that's good advice. Know your place is good. Know your audience. But then you get to a point where, like, now it's time to step up and have a straight spine. And can we do that? I think I'm getting there. I can see the evolution in myself. I think years ago, I was comfortable when I was in university, I was comfortable with having an intellectual voice, an academic voice. And then after that came comfort with having a poet's voice. And then came, and I think the poet's voice always came from wanting to heal something. So the first collection of poetry that I wrote, so cliche, an entire collection of poetry about being heartbroken, you know, gosh, first poet ever who's done that, you know. But it was the working out of like, how do we put ourselves back together again? And then that's where I found my poet voice, because I realized that the poet voice helps me heal. When the poem makes sense, I feel better. It's a way of looking in the mirror, working on it. When the ethnic cleansing campaigns against Armenians began, I had a whole lot more pain to work through. And again, I found the poet's voice. And then I started to realize that I could also be an organizer in this way, not just politically, but I could also bring people together and foster spaces and empower. And so then that voice awakened. I think what I'm stepping into now is the author, the would-be author, and the performer. I think now I'm going from the poet voice to the performer voice, which is the one that will show up. And thank you for offering me the mic. I'm here to support this because I believe in it. Let me show you what I do, what I've been working on, what I believe in. And that is a whole new thing that I've been working on getting to. Really super lucky to be surrounded by poets in our community who have been doing that. Incredible poets of heritage who have been doing that work, and they're models and inspirations to me. And I think that's where I'm at now. I've always been a natural performer, so coming back as a performer is the new. It feels good. It's also a little bit scary, but it feels good.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much. I mean, you've just dropped so many gems for our audience, for us all to think about tonight. So one last question we ask every poet on the Poet Speaks podcast. Why do you need to get your words out?
I think that if you look at, I said a lot of things in this interview. Thanks for giving the space to be able to say some of these things and receiving it. I said a lot of things that point to like evil in the world, and it's different forms. Like we know what white supremacy has been in the United States. We know what Zionism is doing to Palestinians, and I've just talked a little bit about what Pan-Turkism has done to Armenians. I think I'm getting to a point now where I see the world and I see like over here there's fascism, and there's like fascist adjacent people. There are the fascists and the fascist adjacent. Here there are the justice-minded and the justice-minded adjacent. But one thing that I've been kind of struggling with is that adjacency is not active agency. It's kind of waiting to figure out what to do. And adjacency often empowers fascism. And so by doing this work and by being heard, what I'm hoping to do is that we together as activists, as poets, as people of conscience, start to awaken more of the adjacency and turn it into agency. King said that the moral arc of the universe is long, but that it bends toward justice. I think that if you want to find a practical example of why that's true, a century ago when there was a genocide of Armenians and 1.5 million people were killed, there was no international law. The word genocide hadn't been invented yet. And the Armenian genocide was the very first time that crimes against humanity was named. And there were these military tribunals. Then we had Nuremberg trials during the Holocaust. Now we have the ICJ, International Criminal Court, and perpetrators of genocide have warrants out for their arrest. The moral arc of the universe is long, sometimes too long and too slow. But by doing this work, we're helping to bend that arc. And I think that's what this is about. And it's also about representation, making sure that just the other 2 days ago, I gave a reading for the People Stand with Gaza, and there was a Greek in the room who's a solidarity activist, and he came up and he was like, I'm not even Armenian, but it meant so much to hear you there because I'm Greek and our genocide is never mentioned. And those are the moments when you realize as a poet that if you just do your best to be truthful, that is so valuable to people and to others. And I think that's the work. I think the work is just to be as truthful as possible and to work as hard as possible. But again, it's about bending the arc toward justice, toward morality.
Absolutely. All All right. Well, tell us a bit about our final question. Tell us a bit about what the rest of 2025 is looking like for you, any events folks can look into, and tell us where we can check you out in terms of your socials, social media, website, all that good stuff.
Thank you for that opportunity. On Instagram, Majian, it's just my name. Yetvart is Edward in Armenian, so Majian is my personal. And then in the bio there, you'll find my organizing work is under Armenian Nonviolence. You'll find that my poetry organizing work is under The Poetry Unfold. That's where you can find me. What am I looking for in 2025? I'm looking for a publisher. So if you're looking for this kind of material, I'm looking for a final home for the collection. I'm very hopeful that I will find one. And also in the meantime, I'm looking to connect more and more with justice-oriented people, fostering solidarity, talking about what it's meant to be an Armenian for the last 5 years, and finding ways to make that relevant in the broader conversation against what's happening with ICE in this country, what's happening in terms of just, there's so many brutal things taking place. And so I really want to step further into being a performer, to perform more often. That's why I've printed the manuscript, so that I can always perform from it. And to basically step into that more. So anybody who ever wants to put together a show to showcase something justice oriented, that's what I'm here for. That's what I'm trying to do in 2025. And things like this, Amanda, like meeting you and working with you and getting to know you and fostering friendships that are aligned for something deeper. That's what it's about.
Absolutely. All right, Yetvart, thank you so much for being a guest on the Poet Speaks podcast. Everyone, all of Yetvart's information will be down in the details box below, no matter where you listen to this podcast. Be able to check out all his links and all that good stuff. All right, Mr. Yetvart, thank you so much for being a guest today on the Poet Speaks podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. All right, everyone, check out all his amazing stuff. Again, check the details box down below, no matter where you're listening to this podcast. All right, everyone, this is the Poet Speaks. See you soon. Bye-bye.